Dungeon crawlers were always one of those genres that I never really got into when I was younger. It doesn't help that turn-based RPGs almost weren't a thing in Europe in general, so the more hardcore side of things always remained out of reach for me. The Nintendo DS opened a whole world of possibilities for me back when I started diving into its library back in the day. One of the early titles that sucked me in and got me hooked onto something that I didn't know I wanted was Etrian Odyssey. So too many years later, let's see how the original holds up. Etrian Odyssey is a hardcore dungeon crawler that pulls from old Western-made dungeon crawlers on the PC. The series would later go on to do its own thing with a more experimental look at the structures later on, but the original is a very traditional revisiting of old standards. You take on the role of a group of adventurers arriving in Etria, a small town near the entrance to a new dungeon. For several years now, many adventurers have tried uncovering the dungeon's secrets, but none of them have ever succeeded getting to the bottom of it. There's a bit more story here, but that's pretty much all you're going to get with Etrian Odyssey. Although there isn't much in the way of plot, it never comes across as being underwritten by any means. The areas, monsters, items, the main town, the NPCs, and the background of the main town all feel pretty fleshed out. Etrian Odyssey plays its main story loose to give you the room to consider how you think your party would act or think in these situations that they find themselves in. You make your own party of 5 characters across different classes. All of these classes have 4 portraits each. While these are technically 2 male and 2 female designs, the game never calls any of these portraits by any gender, and a lot of the designs are ambiguous enough to work for either gender. Some of the later games would stray away from these kinds of things, almost feeling like they're aimed at people without imagination with how badly they handle these sorts of things. But we're not getting into this yet. Some things are best left untold. At least for now. There's something nice about games with generic classes that lets you name characters. The appeal of naming an XCOM party after people you know just so you can tell them how they died is one of those shared experiences a lot of us have. If we haven't played XCOM, then The Sims is usually something very similar for people. If you can't think of your own in-universe cast to imagine things around, real friends or known fictional characters are often a good shorthand to imagine how things play out. So to demonstrate this idea in this video, I named my party after the cast of Dungeon Meshi, one of my favorite manga, with Laios the Protector, Izutsumi the Landsknecht, Marcel the Alchemist, Senshi the Troubadour, and Chilchak the Medic. People familiar with both the Dungeon Meshi manga and Etrian Odyssey series are probably going to understand the logic behind a lot of these choices immediately. But the less straightforward sounding ones do have some sense behind them, trust me. So, Senshi as a troubadour, basically a bard, he keeps the party morale up with various buffs. But he also gets the skill Relaxing, which regenerates magic every turn. Relaxing lets you idle on weaker enemies to regain magic in the middle of the dungeon. And Chilchak might make more immediate sense as a survivalist. Technically, maybe, but a survivalist has too much direct combat utility. A medic also has to undo a lot of the status effects that boss fights try to trap you with. I did consider Marcel as a medic originally, but I didn't want this playthrough to get too dark. Oh god, oh no. Oh, and Izutsumi could basically solo late game encounters on her own, ending fights in the first turn, you know, if she felt like it. Wait, why are the canaries here already? Anyway, let's advance into the dungeon. Etrian Odyssey's central gimmick that helped it stand out from the crowd was the "No, not you. We're not talking about you yet." The central gimmick was the mapping system, where you use the bottom screen to chart out the areas as you're progressing through them, a throwback to the old PC RPGs it's directly inspired by. Old school dungeon crawler RPGs often wanted you to map out the areas using graph paper. There's a certain appeal towards drawing your own map and later going over your notes to see your progress in an actual chart that you made, like you're a real explorer making sense of the land that you're surrounded by. Not too many games still trust their players to chart out their own progression anymore, besides like La Mulana. Leaving these sorts of things to be automated by mapping systems or online guides. And that's fine. Maybe some of those older games would have had automatic mapping systems if the computers at the time had better storage and memory capacities. But I think the dungeons in those games would have had drastically altered designs, since a lot of the exploration is evaporated with it. But any speculation is out the window when a game makes the decision to go for manual mapping in an area where this is no longer the standard. And on a platform that has a touchscreen at the bottom half of it, it reads like incorporating the strengths of the platform into its game design. And mapping areas is fun. It feels very different from a game doing it automatically, because sooner or later you're confronted with mistakes in mapping that you made earlier. You put a wall where it didn't belong, or you expected a hallway to extend somewhere and you just drew it out in advance even though it didn't. Etrian Odyssey doesn't try to trip you up with its own designs too much. If anything, it does a lot of small things to make your surroundings especially easy to read, even for a first entry in a game with a limited budget. There's a lot of visual clues to help gauge distance in the empty squares in the dungeons when you get to larger clearings, like the small trees spaced right between open squares, or small signs on the walls that help you keep track of how many squares deep the hallway is going off into the distance. Flowers on the ground to help give some minor variety to the tiling itself. It's minimal, but it does a good job of helping you read the area at a glance. Another minor hint the game consistently gives you is the sound of your own footsteps. Every single step forward gives a single sound effect. So even just walking forward, there's never any confusion in the sound design of how many steps you've just taken. It's all really nice. It's still far from perfect though. The first attempt at mapping systems has some major flaws, and some of these strike me as strange in how they even exist in the first place. The first signs of trouble are the damage tiles in the second area of the game. There are no colored tiles and no map markers to help indicate their location. There's clever ways you can get around this, like using event markers to make notes of the beginning and end of the damage tile positioning, so you generally know where damage tiles begin and end glancing at the map. But that doesn't make it any less strange that even in the early game, there are obstacles that you have no native way to keep track of with the in-game map. Later on, you get a lot of one-way passages with no way to indicate which way these go with the tools that you're given. There's always ways that you can creatively solve the issues, but it does make it feel like the maps of the game weren't made for the tools that the game gives you. Later games would learn from this and give you much better mapping tools, and for the most part, you should be fine mapping things out. But it's saying a lot when the online guides are using mapping tools from later entries to create more complete sets of maps than the game lets you put together yourself. Thankfully, you can create maps that are easy enough to read and follow during most of your playthrough, the only exception being the post-game. But we're not going to talk about the post-game. I really do not want to talk about the post-game. Now, before you come to terms with any of this, you'll no doubt learn why they call this a dungeon crawler and not a dungeon runner. Resources are scarce, and combat demands a lot of them. So progress is made slowly but surely as you start gaining more experience, skills, and a better understanding of both the demands of your surroundings and your own limits. Combat in Etrian Odyssey is pretty straightforward, especially in the first game. There's a number of builds you can aim for, but the general complexity of combat is pretty low. The complexity and difficulty is more in the field of how you build your party and what you're spending your skill points in than it is actual combat encounters, at least for the most part. Etrian Odyssey uses a proper full turn system, where you select everyone's abilities for the coming turn and then all the actions play out, with everyone's actions happening in the order of speed. Enemies tend to be coded well enough to read what you're supposed to do at a glance, with some being vulnerable to elemental damage, other physical damage. Some might poison you. Others bind body parts to impose restrictions on actions depending on what body part they hit. It's pretty typical stuff. When you level up, you gain skill points. You get 1 point per level, so you really want to think about what to put your hard-earned points in, as you're not getting too many of them in a playthrough. Skill points are fairly straightforward too, with the general rule being that it's better to be great at one mediocre skill than to be mediocre in a lot of skills. The only problem I have with how skills are implemented here is how hard it can be to read the skill screen in terms of progression. A lot of the more advanced skills require 1 or 2 skills to reach a certain requirement, and they're not always sorted near each other. So it kind of forces you to read through the entire skill menu for the characters to make sense of the skill progression. Later entries in the series would get better about this, and I do intend to cover the whole series over time, so we'll see things improve and change. The biggest takeaway if you play Etrian Odyssey 1 is that for a basic party, you definitely have to have a protector and a medic, so you can max out both defender and immunize, giving you a solid physical and elemental resistance. With just these 2 abilities, you'll go a long way. Landsknecht focusing on swords and rushing all-slash can be nice too, since all-slash tends to end random encounters in a single hit for most of the game, which allows you to level up way faster than normal. Keep in mind that nothing I'm saying is set in stone or anything. You can roll with whatever party you want, but Etrian Odyssey 1 especially is so traditional in party makeup that there are some tried and true standards. Standards where it's hard to go wrong if you stick with them. But that still gives you some room to change things up between playthroughs. I'd never gone through the game with a troubadour before, until I played for this review. So having bravery, relaxing, and being able to give my Landsknecht elemental bonus damage to his standard attacks during some of the bosses was a really comfy experience. As comfy as Etrian Odyssey gets anyway. It's still a really hard game when it comes down to it, even replaying it and being used to how it works. And I'm sure new players can use any help they can get to make sense of some of it. Because sooner or later, we all run into an FOE. FOE stands for Field on Enemy, at least in Japanese. We got Latin gibberish to try and make it sound cool in the US and European releases. Different gibberish names between the 2 releases for whatever reason. Whatever you want to call them, there are these big, fuzzy, orange-looking enemies wandering around on the map, taking 1 step forward every turn. So every time you move on the map, they move. Oh, and every step you take in the dungeon being a turn also translates to every turn in combat being a turn. So every time a turn has passed in combat, FOE on the map also get to move. What makes FOE so fearsome is that they have the ability to invade encounters you're currently engaged in. They're often placed in areas where you have to sneak past them the first time you reach a floor. In a lot of games, this system could end up feeling unfair or broken with encounters being fully random, but Etrian Odyssey gives you a meter on the screen showing you how close you are to a random encounter happening. It won't spring one on you at every step, but every step you have a chance the encounter orb changes color, and when it's red, you're very likely to enter a fight on your next step. So you do get some chance to plan your movement around that of the FOEs, and for the most part, the game never gets too cheap with this. I really do like the encounter orb in the corner of the screen. It takes away a lot of the surprise that you get from random encounters usually. So even in areas where the encounter rate might be higher than normal, it still feels less frustrating than when you are taken by complete surprise like in most games. There's even a few areas where they'll turn movement around FOEs into a puzzle scenario, where they'll only move if you're right in front of them, so you have to pull them out of narrow hallways so you can safely enter. Say what you want about FOE, I just think they're neat. In terms of combat encounters, FOE are kind of like mini-bosses. You might not always be able to clear them immediately, as they're definitely stronger than the random encounters on the floor that you find them on, and they still let you run away as long as you have an empty space behind you on the map that you can back into after leaving the fight. But if you take them down, they're a good source of experience and items. FOE are often placed near boss fights, playing into the boss mechanics of the floor, as demonstrated by the first boss fight, being surrounded by a pack of wolves that will make their way towards the fight, quickly trying to overwhelm you as a group before you take their leader down. Before you go into that fight, the game teaches you how the wolf FOEs in the area will get aggroed if you fight any of the other wolf FOEs on the floor. So it's not an unfair surprise you're presented with when attempting the boss fight for the first time, but you're presented with the question of whether or not you're really ready for this right now. And that's a question that will come up a lot during your playthrough of Etrian Odyssey. Are you ready for this content? Are you sure you don't need more supplies? Should you head back now or push that little bit deeper? The one thing Etrian Odyssey tends to punish you for is being underprepared and under-equipped. since it's a surprisingly fair game, even going so far as to leave you healing points inside the dungeon, so you can get back to full health in the middle of the areas. But if you didn't commit to your decisions or failed to prepare adequately before pushing too far, that's when you'll get torn to shreds. If a party member dies during combat, the options to get them back on their feet are pretty limited, especially in the early game. The healing items to revive them are quite rare, so you don't want to squander them. And even with a medic, it takes a good number of skill points before you get the revive spell. And even when you do get it, it revives party members with almost no health, so you have to spend more TP or resources to heal them after reviving. So in most cases, especially early on, a party member going down is the moment that you'll want to head back to town to recover your party to proper health. Reviving a dead party member is costly, and you'll still have to pay to rest at the inn afterwards as well. And since you probably used an item to get back to town, you'll want another one of those too. It's why you don't want to risk going too deep too soon, because even if you do make it out alive, it might end up being a costly venture with minimal gains. If you don't make it out alive, the game at least lets you save the map you filled in before reloading your last save file, so you don't lose all progress. You get to keep the map, so you have an easier time exploring next time now that you know your limits and the area better. So, how do you prepare for the coming content? There's only the one town after all. You don't have an escalation of gear by going to increasingly better stocked villages along the way. Instead, all the monsters drop materials that you take back to town to sell. Sell enough of certain goods and new items start popping up in stores. This doesn't just go for weapons, armors, and accessories, it also goes for restorative items. A lot of the restorative items tend to be stocked up in limited quantities too, so you cannot just stock up on nectar and expect to revive fallen party members in the dungeon on repeat. If there is one item that is really a hero though, it's the warp wire. Warp wires let you warp back to town immediately upon use. So once your inventory is full or your party is running low on juice, you can safely return to town immediately to prepare for the next dungeon dive. The less celebrated hero of the game are the oils that put elemental damage on your regular attacks. It might not sound like anything too crazy, tons of games have systems like this, giving your damage output an elemental attribute to make use of enemy weaknesses. But Etrian Odyssey has some weirdly jank calculations, and how oils work is one of them. The elemental damage becomes bonus damage next to your regular attack output, so when used to exploit weaknesses, the damage numbers that come out of it are kind of just insane. They must have known oils were obscenely strong because they're only stocked in limited quantities in the shop, but you only need them during boss fights anyway. Then there's taking, mining, and chopping, character skills that all let you gather items at special gathering nodes in the dungeon. Some people make gathering parties, and there's certainly some use to just making 5 gathering characters to rush to the first node and back a few times if you're poverty-stricken after several ruinous dungeon dives. But it doesn't really reach the heights of gather parties in some of the later entries, so I usually give every character one skill in one gathering ability so I can get a couple of the items from these nodes during regular dungeon dives. Item gathering points have another mapping issue specific to the first game of the series. You only get one single map marker for all 3 of the gathering spot types. So at a glance, you cannot tell which of the 3 gathering nodes they are on the map. Progress in Etrian Odyssey can be very slow. You'll often take over an hour to get past individual floors, and that's with multiple 5 to 10 minute dives into it. So being able to take at least a couple of items from the farm points with a regular party is a nice thing to have. Also, you don't have to worry about taking too long in this game. For as much as Etrian Odyssey pays homage to dungeon crawlers before it, at the very least, it won't just curse your characters or have them become useless due to old age like the Wizardry series. Compared to a lot of typical RPGs, Etrian Odyssey might seem like it's for masochists, but even if that's the case, at least it's not for the cryptids that Wizardry is aimed at. There is a calendar system in place with a day and night cycle, but it feels very underutilized in the first game, only becoming relevant for certain quests where you have to be in a certain location at night. Or that one quest where you have to survive in a dungeon for several days straight. I hate that quest. The main thing to keep in mind with the passing of the days is that the FOE revive every few days, and the bosses revive every 2 weeks of in-game time or so. Not that bosses coming back is a major obstacle. Every 5 floors, there's a warp point that lets you start from that floor in the dungeon upon entering, so you don't have to take the entire trip all the way back down every time. But if you want to farm a boss for item drops or get a nice experience boost from the fight, you can always revisit them later. Also, with everything that I'm saying regarding slow pace and grind, this is a handheld RPG. They're often designed to play with not being too bothered by distractions around you, or just having a TV on in the background. Kind of like a lot of the more repetitive long-burn PC strategy or online games now that we're in a dual monitor era. Or the Nintendo Switch for those on the console side of things. It's a very comfortable experience to play through, but you might not want to sit there focusing on it as its only thing on a big screen for long sessions on repeat. Etrian Odyssey was absolutely not built for that kind of experience. That doesn't really detract from the experience in my opinion, but if some of the footage seems a bit repetitive, it's because I didn't want to sit there and record the whole thing with everything else on the PC turned off for the duration of the playthrough. So I didn't. Etrian Odyssey became a fairly big deal on the Nintendo DS, with a longer legacy than probably even Atlus had expected going in, spawning 2 direct sequels on the Nintendo DS, its engine becoming the backbone for Shin Megami Tensei Strange Journey, the basis for the Persona spin-off series Persona Q, where the Q reflects the Japanese name of the series, Seikaiju no Meikyu, 2 crossover entries with the Mystery Dungeon franchise, 2 3DS remakes for the first 2 entries, and 3 proper 3DS entries. What's especially interesting to note with all of this is that the composer for the music has stuck with the franchise pretty much all the way. Outside some of the spin-offs, the franchise music is all done by Yuzo Koshiro. So, for anyone who is a fan of his that hasn't looked into these dungeon crawlers, there's a lot of music for you to appreciate with at least 6 soundtracks worth of music by Yuzo Koshiro. Personally, I really prefer the sound of the first 3 DS games, as they go for a traditional FM synth sound. An inspired choice as it doesn't get too crunched up by the Nintendo DS's horrible speakers. Sure, the DS cartridge could handle more sophisticated modern soundscapes, but the cheap tinny speakers on the system sure as hell couldn't. So a retro throwback getting a retro-styled soundtrack that sounds great is always a good thing. Also, in spite of my bias, my favorite battle theme in the series has to be Etrian Odyssey 4's Storm. So, why review the original first game and not the remake? Why not make it a double review? Well, to be honest, I'm not too fond of Etrian Odyssey Untold. I have major issues with the story mode, taking away most of the imaginative aspects of the series that pulled me towards it, and I don't like the lack of freedom it gives you, since you don't create a full party of your own either. The narrative focus detracts from the experience more than it adds. So you could argue that Classic is the way to go then. But it's clear that Untold was built around the story mode, with new areas that were added for the story mode being taken into consideration for the leveling curve of the game. So with those areas being taken out of it in Classic, there's a worse grind added to an already grindy game. There's some more dubious shortcomings in this version of the game, but I didn't want to waste my time playing through the entire thing to get to them. Also, some of the issues could be considered spoilers in the original game. For as little story as the original release had, there are some endgame implications that the early game in Untold just gives away immediately. It's a shame because a version of the original Etrian Odyssey with the more modern map-making tools does appeal to me, but not like this. I heard Untold 2 is better, but after Untold I kind of just lost interest in the series until just now. As for the original game though, do I still recommend the original Etrian Odyssey on the Nintendo DS? Yeah, it's still pretty different from the rest of the series, and while the map tools might get a little frustrating at times, it's still a good time exploring the dungeon. It also works really well emulated actually. I wasn't too sure what to expect, and this is the first time that I used Melon DS. I used another emulator for the previous games that I recorded on the channel. Melon DS is definitely the way to go. The other emulator would screw up a lot of the text unless you go into the settings and change things specifically for Etrian Odyssey, and that's not great. Also, this game works really well with a mouse and keyboard. It also works quite well with a mouse and controller, which might sound weird, but I'm left-handed, so it's actually more accommodating to me than playing it on original hardware, strangely enough. But yeah, for some people, Etrian Odyssey might feel a bit too bare bones and traditional, but those who can enjoy JRPGs for engaging battle systems should have a good time. Speaking of engaging with things, I asked the people supporting the channel on Patreon how they prefer to engage with maps. Do you prefer it if the map guides you to an item as a reward? Or do you prefer the mapping itself to be a reward in and of itself? Intrinsic versus extrinsic value, basically. Maps leading to rewards won by quite a lot. I think I'm in the opposite camp with this. I really dislike this sort of map use. Any game where you basically go on a treasure hunt and it's just a map and you have to like follow the marker to the map and get the treasure, I hate that. Just give me the item at that point. Like, it's barely even an objective to just walk to an area, at least in my eyes. I always like when an area feels really daunting and big and you don't know where to go, but after a while you start making sense of the area, which is kind of what mapping comes down to, and that is why I like the more intrinsic style of mapping. Shame it's so rare though. Anyway, next time I'd really prefer it if you guys were quiet. As always, this video was brought to you by people supporting the channel on Patreon. If you would like to become one of the names that you see scrolling on the screen right now and vote in future polls, as well as get videos a week early, head over to patreon.com/AboveUp and I will see ya.